What happens to a child when love is never given and fear is all they know? He was born not into joy, but into calculation. A tool, a vessel, a forgotten soul in a world that saw him as a weapon. His name is Gaara, and his silence speaks louder than 1,000 screams. This isn't just the story of a villain. It's the story of a child who was never allowed to be one. From a deserted village where warmth was rare and affection was dangerous, emerged a boy shaped by rejection, loneliness, and confusion. While others played and laughed, Gaara stood alone, watched with suspicion, even by his own family. But deep inside the quiet child was a storm of emotions no one cared to understand until it was too late. In this episode, we uncover the real psychology behind Gaara's fall into darkness. We'll break down the trauma, the distortion, and the silent scream for recognition that drove him to become what the world feared most. But make no mistake, Gaara was not born a monster. He was created by those who should have protected him. Before the hatred, before the silence, before the fear in everyone's eyes, there was just a boy. Born in the harsh lands of Sinagakir, Gaara entered the world not as a son, but as a project. His very existence was part of an experiment to create the perfect weapon, a child soldier infused from birth with a tailed beast. Shukaku, the one tail. The purpose? Power, control, security. But at what cost? From his first breath, Gaara was treated differently. People didn't look at him with affection. They stared with unease, whispered behind his back, and stepped away in fear. Even his siblings, Tamari and Kankuro, were taught to avoid him. The only constant presence was his caretaker, Yeshimaru, one of the few people who seemed to offer him kindness. But kindness, in Gaara's world, was never simple. Let's talk about emotional neglect, a psychological wound often invisible, yet devastating. Children require more than food and safety. They need touch, validation, love. When those needs are unmet, the brain starts to develop in ways that prioritize survival over connection. In Gaara's case, the results were intensified by the presence of Shukaku. The tailed beast fed off his fear, whispering chaos into his thoughts, depriving him of rest, making sleep a dangerous place. This wasn't just insomnia. It was psychological warfare inside a child's mind. Sunagakir, the very place meant to protect its people, treated Gaara like a mistake they were forced to live with. His father, the Kazakij, didn't see a son. He saw a failed weapon, a threat he couldn't control. And so, Gaara learned early that trust was a luxury and love a lie. He began to withdraw, silent, detached. But inside, his emotions were bubbling, wild, and confused. Children aren't born with emotional armor. They build it after being hurt. And Gaara? He was being wounded daily by the coldness of the world around him. Psychologists call this the insecure avoidant attachment style. It forms when a child realizes that expressing emotions leads to pain or rejection. So, they stop expressing. But the feelings don't disappear. They grow, mutate, and eventually explode. That's where Gaara was heading. A child who only wanted to be accepted was becoming a ticking time bomb. And yet, everyone only saw the surface, the silent boy, the sand that moved on its own, the aura of danger. No one looked closer. No one saw the storm forming behind those pale green eyes. But something was coming. Something that would change him forever. Every soul has a breaking point. For Gaara, it came like a whisper through the darkness. Not through an enemy's blade, but from the very hand he thought was reaching out in kindness. Let's go back. In the middle of his desert village, surrounded by suspicion and silence, Gaara had one person who made the world feel a little less hostile. Yashimaru, his caretaker, his mother's brother. A man who, against all odds, smiled at him, who spoke gently, who applied medicine to his wounds not just with hands, but with words. Yashimaru was the thread holding Gaara's humanity together. In a world that watched him with cold eyes and tight lips, Yashimaru made him believe, even if for a moment, that he was not alone. And then it happened. One night, Gaara was ambushed by a masked shinobi. The attack was swift, deadly, filled with intent. But Gaara, protected by the automatic defense of his sand, survived. As the dust settled, he pulled the mask from the fallen figure's face. It was Yashimaru, his only connection, his only source of warmth. Gone, in the most brutal way possible. What followed wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation of everything Gaara believed to be true. Yashimaru revealed that he was sent by the Kazekage, Gaara's own father, to eliminate him. Not because he posed a threat to the village, but because he had become an inconvenience, a failed weapon, an unstable child who reminded them of a mistake. Yashimaru's words cut deeper than any weapon. He claimed that he had never cared for Gaara, that his sister, Gaara's mother, didn't love him, that the kindness Gaara believed in was all a lie. Whether this was the full truth or the twisted command of a cruel mission doesn't matter, because to Gaara, a child already wounded by years of rejection, it was truth. The effect was immediate and irreversible. When a child experiences attachment betrayal, the mind goes into defensive overdrive. According to trauma psychology, betrayal by a caregiver triggers deep neurological and emotional damage. Trust is rewritten as a threat. Emotional connection becomes a liability. And to survive, emotionally, the child detaches completely. Gaara didn't just lose Yashimaru. He lost the idea of being loved. This is where the psychological concept of emotional numbing comes in. To protect itself, the brain begins to shut down emotional responses, especially the vulnerable ones. Sadness, hope, love. What replaces them? Hypervigilance, anger, detachment. Gaara no longer cried. He stopped wanting. He began to build a new self, one that didn't need anyone. He carved a symbol into his forehead, the kanji for love. But it wasn't love as the world knows it. It was twisted. A declaration that he would love only himself because no one else ever had. His philosophy became clear. If I feel nothing for others, then nothing they do can hurt me. This is the rise of the self-centered survival ego, a trait seen in many individuals who have suffered prolonged emotional abandonment. The child internalizes the belief that the world is unsafe, and so they make themselves the only constant, the only thing that matters. Gaara's sand began reacting without his control, not just protecting him, but punishing threats with violent precision. His emotions were no longer regulated by empathy or reason. They were raw, primal, and always on edge. And Shukaku, the tailed beast inside him, only amplified this spiral, whispering chaos into his mind, distorting dreams, turning even sleep into a battleground. Gaara lived in a waking nightmare, unsure where his thoughts ended and the demons began. After the incident with Yashimaru, the village didn't comfort him. They distanced themselves further. The rumors grew. Children were told to stay away. Adults avoided eye contact. Gaara became not a boy, but a shadow that walked among them. In psychology, we call this social rejection compounding trauma. When a person is already suffering from deep wounds and society confirms their worst fears, that they're unwanted, unworthy, unsafe, those wounds turn into permanent scars. And so Gaara gave up. Not on life, but on connection. He stopped looking for kindness. He stopped believing in love. He embraced the mask the world had put on him. If they called him a monster, then he would become one, not because he wanted to hurt, but because being feared was the only way he felt seen. That night, the night Yashimaru fell, was not just a turning point. It was a psychological metamorphosis. Gaara's inner world collapsed, and something new took its place. The boy who once waited by the window for someone to care was gone. In his place stood a being shaped by silence, rejection, and betrayal. Not evil, not insane, just broken in ways no one wanted to see. And as the years passed, the village saw only the surface. The stoic face, the shifting sand, the chilling calm. But deep inside, Gaara was still that same boy, terrified, confused, and alone. But now, instead of reaching out, he would strike first. Instead of asking for love, he would demand fear, because fear was reliable. And so, the shift was complete. Not into a villain, but into something far more tragic. And yet, the story of Gaara was far from over, because even in the darkest places, a spark can survive. But first, that darkness would have to grow. A child rejected becomes a child redefined. But what happens when that new identity is built on pain? Gaara was no longer searching for love. That part of him had been buried, not with words, but with silence. From the outside, he seemed cold, calculating, even ruthless. But inside, a different truth was unfolding. He wasn't acting out of cruelty. He was creating order from chaos. Let's step into his mind. Gaara's thoughts became linear, sharp, logical, and survival-based. He started to live by one rule: only I matter. But this wasn't narcissism. It was emotional self-preservation. When someone grows up believing that relationships bring pain, the only safe relationship is with the self. Others become variables, threats, distractions. His inner world wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with walls. That's why Gaara seemed so emotionally detached. In truth, he was hyper-focused, constantly scanning for betrayal, rejection, or anything that could shake the fragile stability he had built. His powers, especially the sand, responded to emotional spikes. And since his emotions were always on high alert, so was his defense. It was no longer about protecting himself. It was about controlling the outcome. And in a world that had always been unpredictable, control was everything. During the Chunin exams, we see the new Gaara in full form. Cold stare, minimal words, immediate response to perceived threats. His behavior was unsettling, not because he enjoyed hurting others, but because he no longer viewed it as wrong. To him, empathy was a weakness. Compassion was a lie. Why care for people who never cared for you? This mindset aligns with a psychological concept known as defensive emotional detachment. In this state, a person does not lose their capacity for feeling. They suppress it completely to avoid further emotional damage. It's like turning down the volume of the heart just to survive the noise of the world. Gaara wasn't soulless. He was strategic. He built a system inside his mind. If I am feared, I will not be hurt. If I act first, I will not be betrayed. If I trust no one can break me. And to reinforce this belief, he began testing it. Not in private, but in combat. He targeted others not just to win, but to prove a point to himself. He was constantly asking, will they still look away if I make them afraid? Will they finally acknowledge me if I become unstoppable? This wasn't violence for chaos. It was a cry for validation, wrapped in silence. Here's where things get deep. Gaara's behavior mirrors clinical cases of emotional compartmentalization. Individuals with severe emotional trauma often divide their identity into two parts. One that feels everything but hides. One that acts without feeling to protect the first. Gaara's stoic, unshakable exterior was the second identity, a guardian of his broken inner self. The sand, almost like an extension of his subconscious, made his emotions visible. When he felt threatened, it attacked. When he felt alone, it clung to him. It was as if his pain had formed a physical armor. Loyal, like no person ever had been. Shukaku, the demon sealed within him, became more than a passenger. It was a voice, chaotic, relentless, irrational. But ironically, it was also a constant. In Gaara's fractured mind, Even a destructive voice was better than silence. Shukaku was proof he still existed. This duality, Gaara and Shukaku, mirrored internal psychological conflict. The part that wants to feel versus the part that must suppress. The boy versus the weapon. The heart versus the shell. And day by day, that shell hardened. Every now and then, something strange happened. In the middle of combat, in the stillness between moments of chaos, Gaara would pause. A flicker of something behind his eyes. Not rage, but confusion. Almost like he was asking himself, is this really who I am? Or is this just who I had to become? These are signs of cognitive dissonance, when someone's actions don't fully align with who they were deep down. Even buried under all that darkness, Gaara's inner child hadn't been completely erased. It was silent, but still watching. And that made his story even more tragic. Because villains often choose to become who they are. But Gaara? He was shaped by a system that used him, a village that abandoned him, and a world that misunderstood him. His darkness wasn't chaos. It was structure. It was logic. It was survival turned into philosophy. But what no one saw coming, not his enemies, not even his family, was that beneath all that darkness, the real Gaara was still alive. And while the world feared him, he feared something far worse. That maybe the only way to survive was to become someone he could no longer recognize. Because the true enemy wasn't out there. It was inside. Quiet. Patient. Growing. And the real monster? Wasn't the sand. Wasn't the demon. It was what the world made him believe he had to become. There is a moment in every tragic story where the door quietly shuts behind the character, and they don't look back. For Gaara, that moment didn't come with a scream. It came with a whisper, I exist only to destroy. Not long after the trauma of Yashimaru's betrayal, Gaara began to drift further into a mental and emotional void. What was once a child searching for meaning became a vessel of survival. But survival without purpose is like drifting in a storm without a sail. And when a person drifts for too long, they stop looking for land. By the time the Chunin exams arrived, Gaara wasn't just strong. He was something else, untouchable. Not just in combat, but emotionally. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He didn't care. Or at least, that's what it looked like. The turning point came in the Forest of Death, a place designed to test limits, physical, strategic, and emotional. Here, Gaara was exposed to something he had avoided for years: innocence. He crossed paths with people who didn't attack him on sight, who didn't hate him for existing. But instead of softening, Gaara hardened further. Why? Because kindness to someone who's been betrayed isn't comforting. It's terrifying. Psychologically, this is called fear of vulnerability. When someone is deeply hurt by those they once trusted, future affection triggers fear rather than safety. In that moment, Gaara wasn't seeing potential allies. He was seeing future traitors. And so, he struck preemptively, brutally, not because he enjoyed the violence, but because he believed it was the only logical outcome. No connection, no risk, no pain. This was the final wall going up. When Gaara faced Rock Lee in battle, something profound happened. Lee was the first to push Gaara physically and emotionally. Not out of hatred, but with purpose. He fought with passion, not rage. Determination, not ego. For a flicker of a second, Gaara hesitated. But then, he chose annihilation. And it was that choice that signaled something irreversible. Not just a shift in tactics, but in identity. He didn't need to be understood. He didn't want to be loved. He now believed his very existence had only one purpose: eliminate everything that made him feel pain. And if the world was pain, then the world had to go. From a neurological standpoint, Gaara's choices reflect a concept called moral disengagement. This happens when the brain rewires itself to justify destructive behavior as necessary or even righteous. In Gaara's case, hurting others was no longer a moral dilemma. It was a defensive reflex, but it went further. Gaara began to believe that destroying others was the only way to confirm his existence. Without relationships, without community, without love, all that remained was conflict. Fighting became proof that he was real. This aligns with certain cases in psychology where identity becomes fused with power and isolation. When someone has no emotional anchors, they may build identity around what gives them control. For Gaara, that control was fear. He didn't just want to be powerful. He needed others to see him as untouchable, because deep down, the part of him that still remembered being hurt was terrified of being seen as weak again. Here's where the story becomes morally complicated. Gaara wasn't born evil. He was made, step by step, by systems that failed him. The village used him as a weapon. His father treated him like a failed experiment. Even the few who could have helped looked away. So now ask yourself, what would you become if the only thing the world gave you was pain? It's here that Gaara becomes more than a villain. He becomes a mirror to a world that discards the vulnerable, to a society that labels the wounded as dangerous, to a system that creates its own monsters and then blames them for existing. And maybe that's the most chilling part. Not that Gaara crossed a line, but that his logic makes sense. He wasn't irrational. He wasn't out of control. He had simply reached a place where he believed, if the world rejects me, then I will reject the world first. In the heat of the Chunin exam's final phase, Gaara is pushed to his absolute limit, both physically and psychologically. Confronted by Naruto, someone who also grew up isolated and rejected, Gaara is not met with hatred, but with resistance laced with empathy. And this confuses him, because Naruto shouldn't care. Naruto should want to destroy him. But instead, Naruto fights for something, for friends, for bonds, for meaning. And in that moment, Gaara sees something terrifying, that there is another way, that maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be this way. But by then, the damage was done. Because once you've hurt others, once you've embraced the identity of the monster, returning feels impossible. Not because others wouldn't forgive you, but because you can no longer forgive yourself. And so, Gaara continues forward, not with confidence, but with resignation. He is not proud of what he's become, but he doesn't know who else to be. What happens when the monster begins to doubt the mask? There's a terrifying idea in psychology. Sometimes, destruction isn't the result of madness. It's the result of clarity. Gaara didn't spiral because he lost control. He spiraled because he thought he understood how the world worked and accepted it completely. His behavior followed a logic. Cold, precise, consistent. He didn't destroy because he wanted chaos. He destroyed because he believed that connection equals weakness, and pain comes from expecting love in a world that can't give it. This wasn't insanity. This was calculated emotional defense. Let's dive into the brain. People with deep emotional trauma often experience a shift in the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear and threat detection. When it's overactivated for too long, especially in childhood, it rewires how we respond to the world. Trust feels dangerous. Empathy feels foreign. And detachment becomes the new default. Gaara's mind wasn't out of control. It was reorganized. His reactions, choices, and worldview were shaped by neurological adaptation to constant emotional threat. In his case, love didn't bring safety. It brought betrayal. So his brain learned, detach or be destroyed. And once that switch is flipped, returning to emotional vulnerability isn't just hard. It feels impossible. There's a concept in psychology called dehumanization. It's when someone stops seeing others as fully human, not due to hatred, but because It's the only way to silence guilt. Gaara didn't see his opponents as people. He saw them as obstacles, not because he was cruel, but because he couldn't afford to care. Caring was dangerous. Caring meant exposure. Caring meant remembering the pain he worked so hard to forget. So, like many trauma survivors, Gaara adopted a mental shortcut. If I don't acknowledge their feelings, I don't have to feel my own. This logic turned him into a weapon, but a weapon with internal awareness. He knew what he was doing. He just didn't believe there was another way. Gaara operated on a mental system similar to psychological compartmentalization, separating his thoughts, feelings, and behaviors into different boxes to avoid collapse. Box 1. The child who was hurt. Box 2. The monster who survives. Whenever the first box tried to speak, the second one silenced it. And every act of destruction became a way to prove the second box was the only one that mattered. But the truth, both parts were still alive. This internal split is what made Gaara so compelling and so unstable. He wasn't lost. He was at war with himself every second of every day. And ironically, that's what made him more human than most characters around him. Gaara's transformation isn't just fiction. It echoes real-life cases of individuals shaped by rejection, weaponized by institutions, and misunderstood by the very systems that created them. Think of soldiers trained from youth, child prodigies pushed beyond limits, people with extraordinary gifts used and discarded when no longer convenient. In every case, there's a similar logic. If I am valuable only when useful, then I will become untouchable. If the world can't love me, it will fear me. That's not madness. That's cold, flawless survival logic. And perhaps the darkest part of Gaara's story isn't that he fell into darkness. It's that his reasoning made perfect sense. Gaara should have become a cautionary tale, a warning, a name whispered in fear. But instead, he became something else entirely, a leader, a symbol, proof that even those shaped by pain can choose something different. Because here's the twist most people didn't expect, not even Gaara himself. He changed, not overnight, not easily, but slowly, painfully, and fully. And the world that once rejected him began to listen. After the Chunin exams and his devastating fight with Naruto, something broke, not just in his body, but in his belief system. Naruto's words didn't just defeat him physically. They cracked the wall Gaara had spent years building. Because here was someone who had been through the same pain, the same isolation, and had chosen a different path. Naruto fought not to destroy, but to protect. And that act planted a seed. A dangerous, fragile, beautiful seed. Maybe I don't have to be alone. Gaara's journey didn't end in darkness. It led to responsibility. He became the Kazekage, the very leader of the village that once treated him like a tool. But make no mistake, that role didn't erase his past. It reframed it. What Gaara experienced is rare but real. Psychologically, it's known as post-traumatic growth, PTG. When people don't just recover from trauma, they evolve because of it. They find new purpose, new relationships, new identity. Not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by owning it. Gaara didn't erase the monster inside him. He made peace with it. He acknowledged the pain. He honored the child who suffered. And he chose to use his power not as a weapon, but as a shield for others. That's not weakness. That's evolution. Gaara's story is more than anime. It's a myth, a mirror. Because in every one of us, there's a battle between pain and healing, between isolation and connection, between who we were and who we could become. Gaara reminds us that even the darkest past can be the foundation for something greater, but only if we're brave enough to face it. And here's the most haunting part. Gaara wasn't the last. The system that created him still exists, in fiction, in the real world, in the hearts of those unheard. There will always be another child with too much power, and not enough love, Another voice waiting to be silenced or saved. Because for every Gaara that finds the light, there's another still in the shadows asking, will anyone see me before it's too late?